Hello, this is Larry Kotlikoff again with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have Andrew Fesiak with us today. Andrew, we're going to talk about Ukraine and the latest military situation and with a true expert. Andrew is not a Sovietologist, which is the old word for studying Russia and the rest of the Soviet Union, but a Russian-tologist because he's been working on that for many years.
More of a Ukrainianologist.
Ukrainianologist, yeah. So let me just say a few words from his bio, and then I'm going to ask Andrew to fill in the bio. But I asked Andrew, I found Andrew through a friend who's Ukrainian. I asked my friend to find the best person to discuss Ukraine out there, and he found the best person is Andrew. Andrew specializes in security, international affairs, disinformation, ethnicity, and nationalism with a focus on Ukraine and Russia. He was born and raised in Canada. He's been studying Ukraine and Russia since before his first visit to the USSR in 1985. He has lived in Soviet and independent Ukraine for over 20 years and studied at the Institute of Journalism of Sarashevenko, Kiev National University from 1989 to 1991. So he studied journalism. Upon returning to Canada, Andrew pursued a BA and an MA degree at Carleton University Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, followed by a PhD in History and International Relations at York University in Toronto. So Andrew's a journalist. He's a international relations expert. He's a Russian, European, and Eurasian studies expert. So he's the complete package. And he's also been living in Ukraine prior to the invasion with his family. When the Russians invaded, he sent his family abroad, and he's been commuting back and forth between Kiev and other parts of Europe. Right now, we talked to him, he's in Berlin. Andrew, why don't you fill in a little bit more about your engagement with Ukraine, starting a while ago, 25 years ago, and then during this period of invasion?
Sure. Well, I've always been interested in Ukraine. I'm ethnic Ukrainian, born in Canada. So my parents are from the former Eastern Bloc, actually. When they left, they immigrated from Poland, actually, but as Polish citizens, although they're Ukrainian. The whole history there is extremely, interesting, which is probably what got me interested in everything. My mother was deported in 1947 during Akcja Wisła, so her family was deported to Western Poland. My father's family, most people were killed during World War II. His brother was 19 years old when he died in Auschwitz. He lasted a month. His other brother was sent to Buchenwald. He survived 2.5 years. And when he was liberated, he went to Britain for 3 years, and then he moved to Canada, which is why in the end, everyone ended up in Canada, actually, because my father reunited with his brother. But anyway, this whole history has always been fascinating for me. And so this is kind of what got me interested. So the first time I went in 1985 to the former Soviet Union, to Ukraine especially, I spent a month there, actually in a children's camp in Odessa, and I met a lot of friends there, actually. And I'd gone back since that time, since 1985, every year, except for about 3 different years. Other than that, I've been there every year, and I've traveling, right, or living, like now, for example, for over 20 years. So yeah, I've always had a keen interest, and this interest then led to my studies and university studies and so on and so on, and living there, now for such a long time.
But you've also been working with the government, Ukrainian government, on different kinds of projects or different groups in Ukraine.
Yes, especially when the war broke out, there were different groups that I've worked with, right? So for example, there's this one group called the Ukraine World Group, and just kind of unofficially got together lots of people, interested in helping out, especially battling disinformation, Russian disinformation. And so we got together, all sorts of different people from like journalists, NGOs, even some people from the government. Even Foreign Minister Kuleba, by the way, was part of that group actually, but far prior to him being foreign minister. And so we worked together on kind of battling, Russian disinformation, thinking, how we can deal with it and stuff. So that's something I've been doing on my own, even, for longer than that. There was this one episode, actually, it was May 2008, when the Russians actually started this story, and they put it through the whole Western media, actually, about this Ukrainian, supposedly a Ukrainian toy manufacturer who was making Hitler dolls, right, for Ukrainian children. And these Hitler dolls supposedly were a big hit in Ukraine. Ukrainian children loved playing with the dolls of Hitler. It was so popular that this is the story, right, that they were going to start making, Hermann Goring and Goebbels and all the other Nazis, because all these Nazis are just so popular in Ukraine, right? What was incredible about this is that well, the Russians started this as 2008, right? And you have to ask yourself the question, why did they already then try to convince Westerners that Ukrainians are Nazis? But the fact that the Western press was so gullible, I mean, there were serious Western press services like BBC, Deutsche Welle, the Independent, Daily Mail, all sorts, I mean, throughout the West, in the English language, not only in the English language, which were publishing this story, right? And it all originated from the Russians, though, right? And they spread this, and the Western press was so gullible to actually believe that it was true. So this is something that I worked on at the time, actually, just by myself, actually shooting off letters to everybody saying, hey, listen, this is a complete lie. And especially when I think it was the Times, actually, they published something where they quoted a very famous Ukrainian newspaper, Zerkalo Tizhnya, and they quoted the journalist there that he had said this, this, and this. And when I looked at that article, I found the article. There was an article like this, but it was completely different from what they said. And it was actually quite the opposite. So this Ukrainian journalist had actually gone to a market somewhere on the edge of town, and he found one man selling a Hitler doll. But he said in the article that this doll, and he was repulsed by this because, I mean, Ukraine lost around 9 million people during World War II, including 1.5 million Jews. And he was repulsed. He found this repulsive that someone was selling a Hitler doll. But he said the doll cost $200, which is, not, it's completely out of reach for Ukrainian children, and it's made in Taiwan. It's one of these, collector editions. They have Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, and all these things. And so, but the press, they reported this as if it was made in Ukraine, right, for Ukrainian children. So in any case, this is just one of the things that I was already working on, like way back, actually.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So cool. But just by the way, my grandfather, one of my grandfathers, was born in Kiev. So
Okay.
and I've been to Kiev to talk to the government in the past, at least on one trip, and been working in Moscow with economists at the Gaidar Institute for many years now. So I've had some contact with these two countries. Anyway, let's talk about the current situation as you see it. Maybe you want to share your screen and show us some map or so.
Certainly. So yeah, one other thing you can actually mention, I guess, is that why I'm so interested in the military stuff. I've been very interested in the military for a long time, and my master's thesis was on nationalism in the Ukrainian military. And one of the things I did was I went around Ukraine, actually, conducted a sociological survey, which is probably the first and last one independently conducted within the Ukrainian military. So I've been very interested since that time. Now, let me see 1 second. I want to just, okay. Right, 1 second. Let me get a hang of this because it's giving me some sort of a, okay, I see now. Right.
By the way, I should mention to listeners that viewers that this is today's October 3rd, and it's just been a couple of days since Ukraine succeeded in ousting the Russians from an important town called Linia. Forget the name of this town.
Right. Larry, it's making me quit to reopen actually before I can share the screen.
Reopen. Oh, I don't think we want that.
We don't want that. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Uh,
Let's see if it works without that. Let me try again because yeah, see it's okay, it might work actually. It's showing up differently now, so maybe it'll work. Okay, good.
Great, cool.
Right, okay, very good. Yeah.
Fire away.
Okay, so what we're looking at is a map by Deep State, actually. It's a Ukrainian site, which is following the war very closely, and I think they have the best map. I'll zoom out and you'll see the map of Ukraine. And what you're looking at is Ukraine, and all these different areas are, for example, this area is what was occupied by the Russians before 24 or after 2014, before February 24th, right? As is Crimea and other places. So here you have, north of Kyiv, these areas, these are all liberated areas. Kharkiv, right here, these are all liberated. These are areas like here, still occupied by the Russians, as is this area here. So we're going to zoom in. And I know you're interested in knowing what's going on right now. So when we take a look, this is the whole Kharkiv area right here, Kharkiv province, Oblast, which was liberated in the last few weeks. This is Kupiansk right here, Izium. These were major areas that were liberated. And right now, so the Ukraine. Sorry?
Yeah, Lyman was the area I was talking about, the town I was referencing. Right, go ahead.
Right, okay. So yeah, these areas right here, this color here is newly liberated, right? This is kind of the gray zone, let's say, right? Which they're not sure if, which side is controlling it. But what I know is that right here is Crimea. And Ukrainian forces have been Liman right here, which was just liberated like yesterday, the day before. And they're on their way to Crimea right here. And that's a very important area. It's a transport and communications hub. So the Russians bring things in from the north there. And it's also very important for then going and liberating Severodonetsk and Lysychansk here, which the Russians fought over very heavily, actually back in, I think it was June, and lost a great deal of people actually there. So the Ukrainian forces are advancing very, very fast. Right here, Svatove. We don't see it on this map, actually. This map is usually probably a couple of days old. But Svatove, according to Russian bloggers, actually pro-Russian bloggers, they've been complaining that Svatove is now under attack, actually, right? And so if Svatove is taken over, that really cuts off the Russians' transportation links coming from the north. And then especially over here to Starobisk. And that just sets up, an attack for the rest, for down to Luhansk and all that gives the Russians major problems right there if those areas are taken over. And it just appears that, Ukrainian forces are advancing quite quickly and taking over just more and more ground on a daily basis, actually. So this map is not up to the second updated, of course, but you can see what's going on in any case. Now that's all kind of Donetsk, Luhansk Oblast with Kharkiv Oblast in the north there. Right here, the areas here actually, like I said, this color here, this is what the Russians have been occupying since 2014. They have hardly advanced here, if at all, actually, in these areas, as you can see. It's because Ukrainian forces are very well dug in there. So some of the best Ukrainian forces are there, most experienced, actually. They've been there for a long time. And the Russians can hardly advance there. They would like to get Bakhmut right here, okay? But they've gotten nowhere in the last few months, actually. So, and it's just looking worse and worse for them. When we look another area which is extremely important, which is seeing a lot of movement, is this area here. Everyone's heard about Kherson, the city of Kherson right here, right? And this whole area, this is the Dnipro River right here. And so Kherson is divided by the Dnipro River, and Ukrainian forces have blown up all the bridges here so that the Russians are basically stuck in there. And so they are having massive troubles to resupply in this area. So Ukrainian forces have been attacking, as you can see here, this area. But right now, the place where they're having the most success is actually over here. So this area here. And Duchan is a place which, from what I've already heard today, the Ukrainians are already on the doorstep of Duchan, right? So you can expect a lot of movement here in the next few days, actually, right here.
Let's see.
And that's very important because psychologically, if Kherson is the only, it's the only provincial capital, oblast capital, actually, that the Russians were able to occupy. And if that falls, that's a major, that's going to be a major psychological defeat for the Russians, for that to fall. So, and we're getting there in any case.
Wow. So what is the Russians have a much bigger army. They have much more artillery, we're told. Are we talking about, 5-1 in terms of military, in terms of just soldiers on one side versus the other?
Look, it's difficult to say. I'm not so sure the Russians have more soldiers right now. They're drafting a lot, right? They're conscripting a lot, forcing them into the forces. But, these people are unexperienced. They do not have any, experience in fighting, whereas the Ukrainian side is being trained by NATO, by our NATO allies and stuff, friends in NATO, in Britain and elsewhere, and plus, the Ukrainian troops have had a lot of experience fighting for the last 8 years, and especially these last over 7 months, right? So the Russians are bringing in all sorts of new people, but they have a serious problem now with weapons, actually, because when Ukraine received these HIMARS systems and other MLRS systems, they started blowing away, and they still are constantly doing this, is blowing away all sorts of weapons depots and stuff. And so the Russians are in serious trouble now when it comes to these weapons, and this is why you can see that they've now received drones from the Iranians. Apparently they're trying to get something from the North Koreans also. And this is actually, quite shameful, right? That they have to resort to getting things from them. Even their kind of right-wing Russian bloggers are, very upset about this. That, how is it, that great mother Russia is asking the Iranian mullahs for weapons, right? And this is just nonsense for them. So this is actually bad, and more, for more reasons than one, right? Not just because, the Iranians are not making, the best weapons in the world, but also the Russians are running out of weapons. But also the fact that they're not getting them from, the top countries in the world. They're getting them from the Iranians, which is, not good psychologically either. But in June, for example, the Russians were outnumbering the Ukrainians by a large margin. I'm not sure what that margin is right now. Actually, I have not heard those figures for a long time now. What, how much they're outnumbering. But from the Ukrainian side, like I said, you can see with what's going on, these, the counterattacks and everything, that the Russians, they're hurting, actually, when it comes to their weapon system, when it comes to the artillery.
So let me talk about that in a little more detail. Maybe you want to stop the screen share, since we can see the all of you. I think at the top there's an option, maybe the top of your screen. Does it say stop screen share?
To stop the screen sharing, yeah.
Maybe just,
you want to screen share? Yeah, stop share. Yeah, there we go.
There you go. Okay, so these HIMARS and other other types of military equipment coming from NATO, are they dramatically better than the Russians? The Russians are supposed to have many more artillery pieces than Ukrainians, even with the supply. But are the Russians just shooting into the forest, or?
Well, this is the thing. This is why the Russians badly needed these Iranian drones, right? Because the drones give them the eyes to see where they're shooting. Without drones, it's almost impossible. But even then, the HIMARS systems are highly they can hit anywhere very precisely, right? They're extremely precise, whereas the Russian systems aren't nearly as precise, and so this is a problem for them. So sure, they can shoot, but they're not hitting nearly as accurately as the Ukrainians are. And when it comes to again, the distance that these HIMARS have been able to hit, which is about 80 kilometers, I believe. that means the Ukrainians can hit deep within, into Russian lines. One of the big problems for the Russians has always been logistics, right? And so when the Ukrainians are destroying their weapons depots and destroying kind of, all sorts of, delivery, the delivery systems for these weapons, and then the depots and also command posts and stuff, this is a massive problem for them, right? It's a massive problem. And the Ukrainians have been doing this ever since they've been receiving the HIMARS systems. Every day, they are destroying more and more and more. I mean, every time they find out about a new place where they're keeping the stashing weapons, it's destroyed, right? They're highly accurate. So this is great, right? I mean, they don't need to.
Yeah, go ahead. I was
Sorry?
going to say 50 miles is, 50 miles range is not, if you go from Lyman, which is the town that was just, captured, to the Russian border, let's say just due east, how many miles would that represent?
Well, put it this way. Look, it's far. So it's far. So you're right. It doesn't mean that they can hit the Russian border kind of from where Liman is. No, they can't, right? But but that doesn't matter. I mean, that would be great. So it would be great to have those the ATACMS systems, which their range is like 300 kilometers, right? So that would be much better, of course, and much more. It would be fantastic, right? To be able to hit that far in that distance. But even at hitting 50 miles, 80 kilometers, right? What that means is you've got your front line, and the soldiers need to be delivered weapons, to that and to those areas, all these artillery systems. That these are, it's a lot of heavy equipment, which is usually loaded by hand for them, right? And so if you can hit it at that distance of 50 miles away, right, that means they have to keep these things even further, right? And that proves like a big problem for them to then deliver it to the front, right? So that's where the usefulness of this comes in.
The logistics come in. I see. So do you know whether the Russians have knocked out any of the HIMARS? Because I guess that's one of the.
This is a massive secret on the Ukrainian side. So I've not, I mean, the Russians keep saying they hit everything. They've knocked out the entire Ukrainian Air Force. I mean, 3 times, more airplanes than the Ukrainians have. They've knocked out something like 3 times more HIMARS than Ukraine ever received, right? So I mean, they always lie about these things, right? I've never seen a single photo or something where they could actually prove it, right? That's one. And on the Ukrainian side, so even if something has been destroyed, they've been totally quiet about it. So there's no proof that anything's been hit. That doesn't mean nothing's been hit, but the Ukraine side's not going to admit to it, and the Russians can't prove it, right? So
how much do you think the U.S. and other NATO countries are helping with the guidance, with satellite imagery, assisting the Ukrainians? Is that critical?
I think that is critical. So I think the Ukrainians are getting some great intelligence from the US, of course, right? Also, and the Brits, I'm sure, but also just them themselves. What's interesting is, Ukraine developed a kind of an app, right, for your smartphone, which everybody in Ukraine has who has a smartphone. And there's lots of different things in there. Well, one of the things they implemented when the war began was a little function, which is, spot the enemy, basically, right? So you can press the button, you can actually show them where the enemy is. And, I guess if enough people kind of do it, right, then they kind of really do know where the enemy is located, right? So it's kind of neat, actually. And I don't know how much it's been used. I mean, it is being used, right? But I do know that on the ground also, there's lots of people, of course, who are helping out through, this app and other methods to simply, give away the Russian positions and kind of say that, look, and this is for sure. They know that they've, if the Russians are staying, there's a command post, then there's people basically, telling the Ukrainian side that, well, there's a command post there. So the Ukrainians are getting intelligence also from, on the ground, actually, from their own people, right? So there's US intelligence through, spy satellites and all sorts of things like this, but there's the intelligence on the ground also, right? So it all, it all works together and benefits, Ukrainian forces, of course.
So I take it that, so we have a fifth of Ukraine still occupied by Russia. I presume that most of the Ukrainians who are in occupied Ukraine are not supporting Russia. So they're probably sending intelligence as well. Do you have any feeling for the fraction of people in the eastern provinces that are actually pro-Russian?
Well, yeah, from what I'm hearing, right, I mean, there are collaborators, of course, and this is, I mean, natural, in any country, any war, but the great majority, put it this way, there are people who, I know from friends from Kharkiv, for example. I was told by a friend from Kharkiv who said that, he had all these acquaintances who were pro-Russian and stuff. And, and when the war began, I called him to see if he was safe. And I asked him, well, he said he's safe. And I asked him, well, what about all these people that you knew, these acquaintances who were pro-Russian? And he said, as soon as the bombs started landing, right? I mean, these people, it took them no time to become pro-Ukrainian nationalists, right? Just immediately, because it's one thing to be pro-Russian, but when the Russians start launching bombs at you, right? And they're landing outside your balcony and blowing up your windows, well, then you understand that, hey, there's something wrong here. So the point is that even people who may have been, pro-Russian or something, before the Russians invaded, that really changed their mind after. And I think even more so, those areas which were occupied by the Russians, that really, really changed people's minds. Because everywhere the Russians occupied, they tortured people. There's rapes, tortures, murders, all sorts of things like this going on, and that is everywhere. Everywhere they've occupied, they've done that. And I mean, anybody can be, picked up by them and then tortured. It can be someone who was pro-Russian. I mean, they don't care. I mean, they don't know, because of course, if you're arrested by the Russians or picked up by them, maybe you will say, hey, why, don't touch me, I'm pro-Russian, right? But that doesn't mean they're going to believe you, right? So, so this is the problem. And so from what I'm hearing, wherever Ukrainian forces do enter, they are being greeted, and there are some local collaborators, but they're very few, right? So I think the majority of people are on the Ukrainian side, especially now.
And so, all right, my next question is, do you see Ukraine being able to retake all of the occupied territory, including Crimea, leaving out any nuclear response by Putin? Is that in the cards? Is that in the cards in a couple months, in a year? And is it in the cards within a time frame that Ukraine can survive? I mean, the Russians are using cruise missiles, et cetera, to destroy the country, the infrastructure, and I can imagine them attacking Kiev more fundamentally. So, how do you see that?
Yeah, well, look, there's the military part, but of course there's the economic part, which you know very well, and then there's also diplomatic and psychological. All these things are coming together right now against Russia, very seriously against Russia. That regime is crumbling, it really is, and you can see it after, Putin called for this mobilization stuff. So militarily right now, Ukraine is winning. They are pushing the Russians out of all sorts of places. This is a massive psychological defeat for the Russians, who thought they would take over Ukraine within a few days, who thought Ukrainians would greet them with flowers. And, so this is a shock that not only were they not greeted with flowers, Ukrainians put up a resistance, and they've been fighting everywhere, right? And so they are being pushed back right now in all sorts of places, in all the fronts, right? I think we might be pleasantly surprised that how fast this may actually be over with, right? Yeah, the Russians are shooting cruise missiles around, but they're even running out of those, right? And they don't shoot that many per day, though, because they don't have that many left. So, I mean, they've even removed cruise missiles. This is interesting, by the way, because you think they're scared of NATO. Finland's about to join NATO. Well, they've removed actually S-300 missiles from the border with Finland, right? And they brought them to Ukraine. And so, because of course they're not scared of NATO, they're scared of Ukraine right now and losing in Ukraine. So they're using these missiles now actually to fire into Ukraine, but basically on a daily basis, it's about 10 missiles that they fire. And right now, the Ukrainians have gotten better and better at actually downing a lot of those missiles, right? So they still, many hit their target, but I mean, a lot of are actually downed now, right? So, and I mean, the Germans and also the US are promising Ukraine air defenses, right? The IRIS-T system is being promised by the Germans within the next couple of months, and the US is promising the NASAM system, right? So, So, once these arrive, it'll make life a little bit easier also in certain places. Although, I mean, they will not cover all of Ukraine. They'll cover, a few major cities, and and that's it.
These
Probably.
are
But
anti-ballistic
nonetheless,
missiles. Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, these are anti-missile systems, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
Anti-missile system, right.
But when it comes, so the Ukraine army is pushing them out. Again, at the same time, you've got what's happening in Russia. I mean, the Russians call for this mobilization, and now all of a sudden you've got that population quite upset. And there's all sorts of voices now criticizing Putin, criticizing the regime, demonstrations. So this is slowly starting. You've got China and India criticizing also Russia, right? I mean, and their talk for, to use nuclear weapons and simply, the war. So, this last summit in Samarkand, I mean, the Chinese and the Indians made it clear to Putin that they're not pleased with what's going on, right? So that's on the diplomatic front. So there's all sorts of different sides where the Russians are being pressured right now. Again, when it comes to weapons, and this is the other thing, the Ukrainian army is now stronger than it was on February 24th. It's much stronger, whereas the Russians are much, much weaker. They're running out of tanks and other weapon systems, right?
How do you know this? And do you have, I mean, I agree. I mean, it sounds like they are, but, and I've heard that from other sources, but I don't know the sources of the sources,
Sure. Well, we know because of what they're bringing actually into Ukraine. We know what they're bringing into Ukraine, what kind of systems they're bringing in. We know who they're asking for weapons. So, for example, they asked the Belarusians to supply them with weapons. So the Belarusians, took out of, they had weapons in storage, right, out of, and they brought those weapons out of deep storage and they gave them to the Russians, right? So that they're in trouble when they have to ask, their neighboring countries for these, weapon systems and stuff. Now, another thing is that what we found now, since, February 24th, and all sorts of captured weapons from the Russians, is that there are a lot of Western, all sorts of, I want to say the word in Ukraine, actually, detali, but parts, lots of Western parts actually in these Russian weapon systems, right? Microchips and all sorts of things, actually, and this poses a problem with the Russians. That means they cannot build the same weapon systems as they could previously, because now these the West is no longer sending them these things are banned, right? Russia's not receiving all these parts and components and stuff, so this is causing them major problems, right? Which is why with the drones, right, they cannot produce enough of their own drones. They've asked the Iranians for drones, but same with a lot of other things that we've seen that they have thermal imaging systems which were made in France, for example, right? For the Russian tanks and their armored personnel carriers. So, that's it. They're out of those. So even if they take out of deep storage, tanks and other things, these are extremely old systems. Another problem for them is corruption, actually, right? Is that on paper, they've got, thousands and thousands of tanks and aircraft and all sorts of things. But that's on paper, right? But it's such a corrupt system there. They're now finding out. The latest joke is actually complaints among the Russians is that 1.5 million uniforms have gone missing. So they are out of 1.5 million uniforms, right, for their troops. So, and this is funny, that's just uniforms, right? But there's all sorts of other weapons which have just been sold. They've been, broken down, sold for parts and stuff. Just the sheer corruption, it's horrible, right? And so they're now seeing how bad it is.
Well, so let's talk about the big elephant, the really big elephant in the room, which is nuclear response by Russia. Do you see that? You've been observing Putin for as long as anybody and with as much knowledge as anybody. How crazy is this guy? Do you think it seems like he does what he says he's going to do? How scared are you that this is going to happen, that he would, and what would happen after that in response? What do you see us doing?
Well, it is worrisome. It's especially worrisome because Putin has done, some people in the world think he's such a brilliant, strategist, tactician or something like this. I think he's a fool, to be honest with you, because in 2014, to have invaded Crimea and and then the Donbass and the rest of Ukraine as they tried, and to basically make the worst enemy out of their best friends, the Ukrainians, was an extremely foolish thing to do. I mean, sure, he gained some support initially. 85% of Russians supported the annexation of Crimea, but I mean, that support fell very quickly, actually, and any talk of him being worried about NATO was foolish, because I said from way back then, and that who he should be scared of is the Ukrainians, right? Because he's turned his best friends into his worst enemies, right? And that's exactly what's happening right now. So the Ukrainians are defeating the Russian army, right? Because the Ukrainians it's a stab in the back, right? What he did. But the point is that what he did was something extremely foolish, right? And then on February 24th this year again, he did another foolish thing, right? I mean, the Russian security services, all the, FSB and everything, they must have known what was going on the ground, that the Ukrainians would fight, that nobody would, greet them with flowers, and yet they invaded, right? So when people ask me before February 24th, do you think the Russians are going to invade? I would think on the one hand, it would be extremely foolish. And I mean, their secret services must know what's going to happen, right? But on the other hand, I mean, seeing what the Russians did in Crimea, that they invaded there, that they're capable of doing something completely foolish. So this brings us back to the nuclear thing. I mean, look, on the one hand, I think he's been warned, right? He's been warned by Putin, and, his whole crowd there has been warned by Western countries about what would happen if he were to do something like that, make attack with tactical nukes or something like this, either Ukraine or just whatever, launch one, even Snake Island, where it's uninhabited, but if they were to hit it, still this is still a nuclear attack. So they've been warned about this, but you cannot discount the fact that him and his government have done foolish things in the past. So you never know, right? I mean, you just never know. But I should hope also that on the Ukrainian side, I mean, I have no evidence of this, but I should hope that the Ukrainian government would tell him that, look, if you hit us with a nuclear weapon, you've got lots of nuclear sites around you, right? Around Moscow and other places, which, we could potentially destroy also, right? So, I mean, that's not something you would want to say loudly, but, just to kind of let him know that, we have the capability of doing that too, right? And there are Ukrainian, definitely, groups, underground groups in Russia, because there's been lots of explosions all over the place, right? And I don't think they're by accident. So, so
there is a nuclear plant, I think a major one, about 120 miles from Moscow. So it seems like the Ukrainians have their own nuclear weapons. They're just not described as such, but that's what they do have. And I think, what do you think the U.S. might be privately warning Putin? What do you think the counter threat is that the U.S. might be sending to Putin?
Well, General Petraeus actually made some interesting statements the other day. He said basically that, they would sink the entire Black Sea fleet and, stuff. I think Ben Hodges also said the same thing, and they could also, attack Russian troops within Ukraine. So these guys are not part of the U.S. government right now. So, I mean, I don't know, but it depends, right? It's really difficult to say what they would do.
Yeah. What about taking out Putin himself? I mean,
well, I don't know how you do that, right? What do you do? Send, do you send a missile into the Kremlin or something? Or, I think that would be extremely difficult, right? This isn't bin Laden where, you can kind of fly in, Pakistan through Pakistani airspace or something like this. I mean, the Russians flying into Russian airspace would be considerably different, of course, right? So I think that would be quite impossible. I mean, listen, unless they have, I mean, the US is getting very good intelligence about what the Russians were going to do. So unless they have an inside person there, I mean, I don't know, right? But, I think
we do have cruise missiles, and if we know where he is, we can presumably take him out. I think the best strategy is to threaten him with instant death if he launches a nuclear strike, because this may be the only thing he cares about, his own life.
Well, one thing I can say, yeah, he doesn't seem suicidal. I mean, he's made foolish decisions in the past, but he's not suicidal. The things we do know about him is that he's, extremely careful about his health. I mean, you've seen how he sits at tables, 20 meters away, from his his defense minister and things like this. So he's very worried about his health, apparently. He uses Botox, right? So to make himself look better, right? Less wrinkles and stuff. So this is not a person who's suicidal. He's obviously someone who cares about, himself, his health, and how he looks, right? So I don't think that's the sort of person who would start a nuclear war, right? He must be, but he must be, made aware that he can't get away with it, right? And that's the important part, right? To let him know he can't get away with launching a nuclear weapon at Ukraine and get away with it.
I think it has to be, I think that message has to be very personal. I think General McMaster was on yesterday or the day before, I guess it was yesterday, talking on one of the news shows about if Russia launches a nuclear strike or blows up a nuclear plant in Ukraine, that Putin needs to understand that's a suicide mission. He used that term. So that connects back to what I'm just saying, that, and I've been thinking this and writing about this for 6 months, that the best threat, counter threat, the best red line is to say, if you use nukes, you'll be dead instantly. We probably have a pretty good idea where he is because he's going out in public, right?
Right.
So, anyway, that's just one. I think that, and the fact that the Ukrainians can blow up nuclear plants in Russia in response, hopefully will keep this from going in that direction. But
yes, exactly.
we've seen this
Because that is worrisome. It does worry everyone in Ukraine, of course, right? Because you never know. And people are starting to think he is crazy in any case. I mean, he's done a lot of foolish things, but since February 24th, they're starting to think, yeah, he is crazy, actually, right? But crazy doesn't mean that he's going to launch a nuclear weapon, or that, again, that he doesn't care about his own health and well-being, right? So,
So let me ask you this other question. I mean, Putin had the option, maybe he was turned down, but he could have been pressing through time to have Russia join NATO. I think there was some conversation about that in the past. He, I think, pushed for that at some level. Was that a big mistake on the part of the West? And does, we have some commentators in the US, for example, Jeff Sachs, a friend of mine, has been arguing that in some ways, Russia is defending itself because it's been increasingly encircled by NATO through the years because of more countries joining NATO, and that Putin somehow is justified, or might be viewed as justified, in trying to defend Russia because it's being encircled. My view is that people figured out in these countries that Putin was kind of Hitler in drag, and that they needed to have a self-defense in place, and that and thank God they did join NATO. That all the countries that did have joined, because I think it's one thing to be expanding NATO when you're dealing with maybe Yeltsin, somebody who's more reasonable. It's another thing to be trying to defend yourself. So I don't give any credence to that argument that Jeff and others are making at all. But I was wondering what your reaction. Would it have been better historically for NATO not to have expanded?
right. Well, first of all, what I'll say is this, right? Is that I think it's complete baloney that NATO expansion had anything to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine or any of this, okay? When Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO, Putin he came out and said that we have no problem with Finland or Sweden joining NATO, right? He said that we have a problem with Ukraine because we have a territorial dispute, right? Which, okay, so there you go, right? But the real reason is actually why he invaded Ukraine is imperialist ambitions. And when it comes to NATO, the Russians are not against, they're not scared of NATO, that NATO is going to invade Russia. They're not scared for their own security. The fact that they've removed missiles from the border with Finland right now, when Finland's about to join NATO, proves that actually, okay? So they're not scared of NATO. If they were, they would be much more worried about their own military, thinking that, well, now NATO can attack them and they need to, you know, save missiles and tanks to fight NATO, right? You know, so they're not scared about NATO, right? You know, again, what their problem with NATO is that any country that joins NATO, right, is then out of reach of Russia, right? That country will no longer ever be part of any Russian imperial project, okay? So when Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia join NATO, right, you know, the Russians can no longer invade them and make them part of Russia, right? As they right now did with Ukraine, right? So, and, you know, to say, no, there's no imperialist project. Well, look, just a few days ago, they just, you know, tried to annex a few Ukrainian provinces, right? I mean, that is their goal, to annex all of Ukraine, right? You know, they want to make Ukraine part of Russia completely, erase Ukrainian, you know, language, culture, history, everything, and make it part of like an imperial Russia, because they feel, and everyone knows about this, Putin's been crying about the end of the Soviet Union. Well, if you unite Ukraine with Russia, Russia then becomes a superpower again, right? And this is where this is all coming from, right? You know, so that will make Russia great again, let's say, you know, in the words of one of your presidents, just saying it a little bit differently. But anyway, so this is why Ukraine is so important to Russia. With Ukraine and Ukraine's, you know, potential, you know, its industrial, human potential and all that. I mean, you know, Russia is now no longer a country of 143 million people. It's a country of closer to 200 million people, right? And the percentage of Slavs is much greater in that percentage also, because within Russia right now, it's 100 million ethnic Russians and 43 million non-ethnic Russians and non-Slavs, and non-Christians for that matter. So this is why Ukraine is important. So in any case, NATO expansion has nothing to do with it, other than, again, if you're a part of NATO, Russia cannot invade you, attack you, and make you part of Russia, right? That's the threat. It is not a threat to Russian security. It is a threat to Russian imperial ambitions, okay? So now, going back, however, when you know, mentioned, was it a mistake not to invite Russia into NATO? Well, look, just a reminder of history, right? You know, when the Soviet Union fell apart, you had wars and you had Russia sticking its nose in places like Nagorno-Karabakh and places like Moldova. I mean, immediately there was already the Russian army in those places, right? And helping separatists in those places, okay? Then if you remember Yeltsin, right? You know, he was the Democrat, but he brought in a tank and he was shooting with a tank at his you know, Parliament building, at the White House, as they called it at the time, right? You know, so you have to understand, you know, if you're a country in Eastern Europe who, you know, was just, you know, freed from, you know, Soviet occupation, and you're seeing these things and you're seeing what they're doing, you're gonna say, hey, let us in, and that's what they did. They could see what was going on, right? The Western Europeans and maybe Americans kind of saw these things, but, you know, not nearly as closely as, you know, the countries of in the Baltic region, right, or Poland, or, you know, or the other Eastern European countries, you know, when they saw very closely what was happening, right? And then when Putin comes into power, right, you've got these apartment bombings, right, which look, you know, were investigated, by the way. You remember there were these apartment bombings, which then led to the invasion of Chechnya, you know, the Second Chechen War, right? You know, and of course, you had the First Chechen War and the brutality of that, right? So of course, everybody's looking at that. You know, all the Eastern European countries are looking at that and saying, oh my God, look what Russia's doing there. And there were horrible things happening there. I mean, massacres and tortures and you name it, right? You know, then of course, apartment bombings, right? Again, the Second Chechen War, and those apartment bombings were done by the FSB. I think it's pretty clear. I mean, they were not done by the Chechens, right? You know, they were carried out by the FSB because the last bomb, as you recall, it was found out by someone living in the building who called the police. The police came. It was a bomb, but then the FSB showed up and said, "Yeah, it's ours. It was just a test, right? And just forget about it, right?" You know, so but it was a bomb, right? You know, so. Yeah, you recall that. Yeah. But then, of course, you know, there was a second Chechen invasion. So, you know, all these things, I mean, this was all happening, right? And of course, these countries in Eastern Europe are looking at this and saying, oh my God, look what Russia's doing. I mean, they have not changed. They're getting worse, right? And by the way, the investigative committee that was investigating those apartment bombings, every single member of that committee was murdered. Okay, they all died. Okay, the people investigating those apartment bombings, right? So and people know this, right? Politkovskaya, right? She was very famous, right? But many others, right? And so Americans maybe don't remember this, or or many Americans maybe didn't see this or follow that news, right? But in Eastern Europe, a lot of people saw this and they saw what was going on with Russia. So that's why it wasn't NATO forcing them into NATO. It was those countries knocking the door down in NATO and saying, let us in, you owe us one, right? So so I think it's completely foolish to say that, oh, poor Russia, right? Poor Russia, they didn't bring them into NATO. I mean, this expansion surrounded, listen, look at the map, surrounded by NATO. That's a joke. I mean, Russia's the biggest country in the world. I don't know what amount of its landmass has a NATO border, but it's extremely small. It's extremely small. So they are not at all surrounded by NATO, right? I mean, that's just ridiculous, actually, right? So I think they do not have a leg to stand on about NATO expansion. And again, like I said, Putin just himself admitted that he has no problem with NATO expansion. Sweden and Finland joined, no problem whatsoever, right? So it has nothing to do with NATO expansion.
I agree 100%, but I just want to hear you on this. But the last question is, how do you see things ending, assuming we don't have World War III? Let's assume that Putin doesn't use nuclear weapons. Let's suppose that the Russian army collapses in the next few weeks, as some US military are saying is likely to happen, or could happen, maybe not likely, but could well happen. Do you see Ukraine taking over all of the occupied areas, including Crimea? And do you see Russia suing for peace, or do you see Putin ousted? What do you think could happen?
Yeah, good question. There's so many different ways this can end. First of all, I'll say this, is that Ukraine will liberate all of its territories. That is the goal. The Ukrainian government owes that to its people, because everywhere where the Russian army is occupying Ukrainian territory, there are Ukrainian people there, living there, who are being, raped, tortured, massacred. And so it would be wrong. It would be, absolutely, just completely wrong for the Ukrainian government to say, okay, let's just, we've kind of fought enough. Let's sue for peace now and let all those other Ukrainian territories which are occupied and our people who are occupied, let them live under Russia, right? I mean, that's just completely unfair and wrong, and the Ukrainian people, never mind Zelensky, I mean, who also agrees with that, but I mean, the Ukrainian people would just say no. I mean, all of us have friends and family in these occupied areas and stuff, and it's horrible what's happening there. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. Every new place which is liberated, we see torture chambers, we see all sorts of mass graves and all these things, right? So but even Crimea, right? I mean, I have lots of friends and acquaintances in Crimea, and Crimean Tatar friends have had to flee, so that they're not mobilized into the Russian army. So they fled, right? Then there's other people who are just waiting. Even ethnic Russians, friends of mine, are really waiting for Ukraine to come and liberate Crimea too. So again, this is even those people in Crimea who may have been pro-Russian before Russia occupied Crimea, I think now they understand for the last 8 years what's been going on, that yeah, life is not better under Russia, life is worse. And therefore, there are a lot of people in Crimea who are now, they very much want Ukraine to return. And, I mean, especially Crimean Tatars, but I mean, lots of even, Russians there,
Okay, so Ukraine continues, they liberate the entire eastern occupied areas. Russia sues for peace, Putin surrenders, or Putin shoots himself, or somebody shoots Putin. What happens?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm not, I'm not a fortune teller, right? But the best thing to happen would be that one of the people around him get rid of him, basically, right? And so, if you think about it, all the people around him, they're all like him anyway, right? I mean, they all supported this. But the thing is this, right? I mean, they can get rid of Putin and basically say, well, it was all his fault. It was all his fault. he's gone now, so now we can do something different, right? Even if they were totally in favor of it, right? So that would be the hope. I mean, I think most people in Ukraine would hope that, yeah, that his own people will get rid of him, and that's it, and just get out of here, right? Get out of Ukraine by yourselves, right? Because that's, Ukraine doesn't want to take over Russian territories. Ukraine doesn't want to, this isn't World War II. We don't, need to march on Berlin or, now march on Moscow, right? I mean, nobody wants any piece of Russian territory in Ukraine. Like even the most ultra right-wing Ukrainian nationalist has absolutely zero desire to take over any Russian territory, right? So they just want them out of Ukraine. That's it, right? Just get out, and that's it, and the war ends there, right? So, and then whether Putin survives or whatever happens to him, maybe his regime would survive for another couple of years, like Milosevic or something, or maybe who knows? I mean, we do not bid him well, that's for sure. But as long as they're out of Ukraine, I mean, who cares? I mean, for Ukraine, yeah, it would be important that that regime falls, right? Because so that they do not repeat it again. So it's not a second Chechnya where they lost the first Chechen war, but then they rearmed, got stronger, and they reinvaded, right? So Ukrainians are very well aware of that, right?
Well, this is my last question then. Ukraine joining NATO. You see this happening. It seems like at the end of this war, Ukraine needs to have some clear security agreement with defense pact with the US or with a group of NATO countries, or with NATO, in NATO, period, because of the fact that this could happen again, or it could happen. They would live under the constant threat of nuclear or other kinds of attacks by Russia. Is that your view too, that this is really a requisite even for the West, because the West doesn't want to see this happen again either, right? It's very expensive for the West.
Well,
and, very dangerous.
Definitely. I think even for, if Ukraine had become a member of NATO in 2008, there is no doubt in my mind or anyone else's mind in Ukraine that there would be no war right now. There would not have been an invasion in 2014. There would be no war, right? None of this would have happened, actually. There's no doubt about that. So, the way to put an end to this is future, maybe Russian aggression would be to bring Ukraine into NATO. Yes. Of course, and that's, it's funny because before 2014, the number of people, the percentage of people in Ukraine who wanted to join NATO was, extremely small, right? It was extremely small because as far as we were concerned in Ukraine, we were surrounded by all our, friends, right? The Russians were our best friends, the Belarusians are great friends, and the Poles and the Romanians and the Moldovans, right? Everyone's our great friend, right? So, we don't need nuclear weapons, right? We gave them up, and hey, why bother joining NATO, right? We had this multi-vector foreign policy, right? So it meant, friendly with everybody, trading with everybody, and it all sounded nice, right? Until you get invaded by your best friend, right? And so, of course, nobody's going to put up with that again. So, you know what? I'll say this: if Ukraine is not brought into NATO, I don't know. Ukraine, put it this way: the Ukrainians look at Israel very closely and learn from Israel. Israel for us really is, a country to learn from in the military way, right? What they've done, how they've organized their army and all their defenses and everything. It's fantastic, and Ukrainians will really learn from them. Well, there's one other thing Israel has, and that's a nuclear weapon, right? Ukraine had them, right? And gave them up. Now, you can say all these things about, and people always say, oh, but Ukraine didn't have control of them. Listen, Ukraine has amazing engineers. I have no doubt that they would have made control of them, rather quickly, right? And I'm sure even now, if Ukrainians want to, right, they will make a nuclear weapon, right? So basically, sure, it's expensive, this and that, but Ukrainians are good at making things on the cheap, actually, right? So I'm sure that they'll be able to make it. They have the brains to make it. They have the capabilities. It is Ukraine's, actually, President Kuchma, his old job as the director of Yuzhmash, or Pivdenmash in Ukraine, right, which is the largest missile factory in the world, right? They made the ICBMs, which Russia now has, by the way. the Satan rockets, right? Those were made in Ukraine at this, Pivdenmash factory, okay? They designed them and they made them there. So Ukraine has the capabilities of making nuclear weapons, right? It can make them, right? And so basically, wouldn't it be better just to bring Ukraine into NATO, right? I think that would be better. But, if Ukraine's not brought into NATO, then, I think that a lot of people will demand that Ukraine do something serious for its own defense. And so, going back to nuclear may be the answer to that, right? And I don't think anyone really wants to do that, because it'd be much better just be in NATO, right? But anything can happen, of course.
Well, Andrew, this has been a really extremely interesting and elucidating and much better than anything conversation I've heard from any commentator in 7 or so months since, or whatever, 9 months since this war began. I guess it's 7. Anyway, I want to thank you a lot, and hope you wish you the best and stay safe as you go back and forth to Kiev. And we'll keep in touch and hopefully do this again when Ukraine is declaring victory. Definitely,
yes. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. And it was a pleasure talking to you again. And all the best to you also. And and please keep the weapons coming, because that's what's going to help Ukraine defeat the Russians, of course.
Hopefully that I think everybody in the country, not everybody, there might be Donald Trump or so, a few of his buddies, supporters, feel the same way, that we should keep the weapons coming. And you see lots of signs of support for Ukraine among ordinary Americans around the country, flags and so forth. So this feels like England being attacked by Hitler at the beginning of World War II, no question.
Yes, definitely.
So best of luck to Ukraine, and we'll be in touch.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.